Hi, and welcome to another episode of the Global Tales of Carbon Transition podcast. My name's Jackie, and I'm joined today by my co hosts Joaquim and Eric. Today, we have a double bill for you. We have the pleasure of speaking to two very exciting guests, Eli Sandler and Olivia Azedegan. Eli is a research fellow at Harvard's Belfer Center of Science, Technology, and Public Policy, and Olivia is a senior energy manager at the Global Methane Hub. Welcome, Olivia and Eli.
Thank you very much. Great to be here.
Thank you.
So perhaps to start us off today, Eli and Olivia, and then I'll hand over to Eric. Could you tell us a bit about your own decarbonization journeys and how you got to where you are today? Perhaps starting with Eli.
Sure. Super interesting. So as you mentioned, I teach energy policy at the Harvard Kennedy School. Before that, though, I ran an infrastructure fund and business that I started based in the Middle East. And before that, I worked at Morgan Stanley. And this is like 2012 when I started working on infrastructure. And that's much more about energy than decarbonization. So if you look at every country on Earth, the use of per capita directly correlates with everything we want, with falling infant mortality, raising life expectancies, better standards of living. And so the central question that we've always had is how to get more energy to developing countries and how to have things like energy security and energy affordability in developed countries. That's what I was working on in Morgan Stanley when I was helping run our sustainable finance business. And over the last 15 years, that question got tied into this point about energy sustainability. So for me, this has always been about what now in the United States we call energy abundance, but doing that in a way that means we don't only have energy security and cheap access to electricity and power, but also we do this in a way that's forward-looking, because ultimately renewable energy and decarbonization over the long term, and I'm sure we'll get into it, is actually the cheapest form of energy. And also because it can be produced anywhere on the planet, we're not reliant on hydrocarbons. It's also a way in which countries can guarantee energy security.
Thanks. And Olivia?
Yeah, great, thanks. So I've spent 6 years working on global climate energy related challenges, specifically focused on Europe and the Middle East, in the world of nonprofits and international organizations. I'm currently at a fund where we have the same goals of pushing solutions, pragmatic approaches, working at the intersection of markets, technologies, regulations, and policy, all with the view to build an energy system that's kinder to the planet. I've spent 4 years in the UAE. I'm currently in London, and my work at the moment with the Global Methane Hub is filling this role of elevating the topic of methane, just to highlight some of the challenges of why we're so focused on methane. We talk about methane as the fastest way to drive down global temperatures in the next 10 years. It's an incredibly potent greenhouse gas. It's over 80 times more potent than CO2, which means curbing the emissions is really important along with other greenhouse gases such as CO2. And the reason this matters so much is because in the short term, we call this pulling the emergency brake on climate. This is about cleaning up the existing energy system. The term we use is super pollutants. So that's methane, black carbon, nitrous oxides, other super pollutants, which in small quantities really do drive much more warming than per ton than CO2. And then also beyond just the energy system, these pollutants are a public health crisis too. Poor air quality contributes to heart diseases, strokes, lung cancer, respiratory issues. So really, this is about targeting the leaks, venting, flaring, and and this is really the fund that gets behind the Global Methane Pledge that was launched at the UK COP, where we now have 155 country signatories recognizing how imperative it is to get behind pulling the emergency brake on climate and curbing our methane emissions. But I can get more into what some of that means and some of my work in the Middle East, but just broad scene setting of where I'm at now.
Yeah, super interesting. Taking over a bit of questions from Jackie here. Super inspiring stories, how you got into it. I think for our audience of energy executives and younger students, both can take some learnings already from that. To take us a bit to the 10,000 feet high and of the world where we stand, we now are definitely in a multipolar world where there is competition between US, China, perhaps Europe, perhaps India, countries like Brazil, everybody working towards what is the holy grail of energy in very different ways. Some of them, and it looks like United States, at least some players like AI investors like, what was it, Elon Musk Center basically works on natural gas. Last time I looked, that's a lot of methane. But still, basically, energy abundance, energy hunger takes the precedence. In parallel, we have a world where, well, there is no more public funding from United States government towards global development of global south. So those are some say it's maybe 20% of the money falling away. So we need to rethink how to do this clean energy transition. So coming both to you, first maybe a view from Ally, from what is the new model for us to finance that global transition, and then afterwards I'll come with the same question to you, Olivia, because you're, let's say, an actor in that system as an NGO. You're fighting for against methane, and you have your good reasons. There are some who say, well, we can solve that, right? And we can put carbon capture and reusage. So people have different visions, and how you as an actor think we need to go forward, right, in this world where maybe we need via abundance of energy. So but first to Ally, so what is our new model to invest in clean energy transition?
Okay, so I'm gonna really strongly agree with you about one thing you said and disagree with another. And the thing I agree with is that there's a huge need for on emissions from developing economies in the future. So if you look at historic emissions, they come from Western Europe, they come from here in the United States, and a couple other developed markets. But if you look out to 2050 and 2100, essentially whatever path the US or Europe takes, the high emissive path, the low emissive path, they're within a bound. American emissions are not going to be more than 5% of future emissions. They're probably going to be a lot less, to be honest. And we can get into what's going to happen in the United States. And so if we think about what people call the remaining carbon budget, which is the amount of CO2 in an optimal world we would emit between now and 2050, whatever path we choose in developed economies, the vast majority of that budget is going to be India, it's going to be China, it's going to be Nigeria. And so the climate question we're facing is actually the same as the energy question from what I mentioned before, which is how will developing economies industrialize? Will they industrialize like we did in the West? Very, very quickly using hydrocarbons. These are amazing substances, huge amounts of energy, but they also produce CO2. Or they industrialize in a clean manner, let's say from renewable energy. So I completely agree with you that how these big middle income economies are going to reach, let's say, the same energy use per capita as we have in the US, that is a key question. Where I disagree with you is that I don't think the changes in US policy, the withdrawal of USAID from the global stage, while I would by no means support it, and I think USAID has done great work, I don't think it changes what needs to happen in the energy transition. Because ultimately this is a private sector financed endeavor. There is simply not enough money in government coffers or in multilateral development banks for the energy transition to be publicly funded. What we are talking about here is a transformation of the way the private sector economy works. And so if you look in the United States, about 93, maybe a little bit more, 93% of spending on clean energy is from the private sector. If you look in Africa, that's reversed. About 90% of spending in Africa on the clean energy transition is from the public sector. That's mostly international development, but to some extent, a small amount of private sector as well. And that is not a way to transform an economy. You simply cannot do it with public sector dollars. And so if your question is like, what needs to change about how our model is of what the transformation of these economies will entail, nothing has changed. The key point is still get the private sector to invest in renewable energy, get the private sector to invest in green industry. Nothing has changed. And actually, in some ways, the pullback from international development has made this even more acute, because the last 30, 40 years of development policy, unfortunately, has been a reliance on international aid, often very inefficiently spent, that has not ended up, despite our best efforts, in creating private sector markets. The point of US aid when it was set up by President Kennedy was to create private sector markets that could then be the backbone of development in what was then called the third world. And it didn't work. And so I don't think anything needs to change in the model. How we can achieve that, what public policy levers, what should philanthropy do, what should governments do, happy to talk about it. But it's the key point of what I just said is this is a private sector question. And actually the outlook is pretty good, because clean energy is, if you can get a low cost of capital and you can get the enabling infrastructure like transmission, government regulation, etc., clean energy is in the long run the cheapest way to generate electricity.
Eli, can I ask you there? Is it correct? Is it correct understanding that that instead of money from the government, it's more important that there are policies, for example, related to taxation and so that could support the private investments than handing out money, instead giving some tax breaks or whatever kind of. Is that how you see it?
This is interesting. It's an interesting question. So there is no energy system in the world that isn't like inseparably integrated in public policy, be it subsidies, be it regulation, be it building transmission lines. Like generating and distributing energy is fundamentally a thing that the government does, even if it's in partnership with the private sector. You can't deliver hydrocarbons and you can't deliver electricity made from renewable sources to people's homes without government. And so I think trying to say this is, we're going to pull away from subsidies such as they are, is not quite the right way to think about it. The way I would think about this is actually look at the different business model of clean energy and hydrocarbons. When you're building a solar field versus a gas refinery, when you're using electric vehicles versus internal combustion engines, or when you're using green steel versus traditional coal-based steel, the renewable, the clean option is a really high investment upfront, really high capex, and very low opex. The fuel, because the sun is free, but you need to install an expensive bit of equipment. What this means is if you have a low cost of capital, i.e., if you can get investment levels high, you will naturally actually favor renewable energy. So where costs of capital are low, where it's easy to borrow money, where there's a lot of private sector credit available, the private sector will borrow, it will invest, because over the long term, OPEX is so low, you're not paying for fuel with renewable energy, that actually you will push towards the green transition. That means that the question of how we incentivize a green industrialization rather than a brown industrialization in Nigeria or India is actually the same question of how we incentivize investment more generally. We have to reduce risk. We have to lower the cost of capital. We have to make sure that investors know that they can put money into these economies for the long term. And if we can do that, then, and there's a lot of financial modeling I can go into here, but what you will see is you will naturally put money into renewables and green technologies. If, however, what you're worried about is getting your money out quickly, getting really, really high returns because they're very, very volatile and you're worried about risk, you're going to end up investing in extractive industries like mining and fossil fuels, low capex things like refineries, which produce power from, let's say, gas or coal. And so like the question I don't think is about do we use subsidies or not? The question is, can we reduce the fundamental risk of the economy to give investors the confidence that long term they can invest in the best technologies?
Interesting. How do we transfer from a OPEX-driven energy world to CAPEX-driven world, not even using the words fossil? I think would be also interesting now to bring in perspective of Olivia, who is NGO. Today here you're in the Methane hub role. Well, you're fighting the corner at least again, my reading of it, Olivia, you are not technology agnostic. You are saying wherever methane is involved, unless you can show me that you've managed mitigating the methane leakage to close to zero, I think it's a really bad idea, right? But effectively, through your work, you're then, suggesting that some countries need to turn off their natural gas investments if they cannot show that they will manage methane leakage because they're endangering the world. You're also saying effectively, at least some may say, I heard that in some COP meetings when I was present, some African countries say, but then you're denying us let's say, the wealth development that you guys in the more Western world, already the global North, have gone through. So, if you want to do it, fine, but don't impose it on us, right? So allow organizations like World Bank or private banks to lend us money to develop gas assets or oil assets. I'll stop here. This is just one also to provoke your, let's say, response. How do you as NGO see us developing clean energy transition, and particularly from the Methane Hub perspective in the new world?
Yeah, so GMH, whilst we sometimes seem like we play more of a role as an NGO, we're actually more of a funder with philanthropic money, where we spend that money to empower civil society groups, although we work with them. So we empower civil society groups, technology, policy, financing, basically any lever it takes, across different, both developed markets and developing markets, to keep the attention on the methane issues. So a lot of what we do is about empowering local stakeholders with the tools, whether it's the data, the financing, the technology, to be able to take ownership of these issues and integrate them into part of their own economy and ecosystem. Now, developing countries are expected to double their emissions by 2050. So this is a development challenge. This is a global south challenge. But where I agree that this is going to be up to the private sector to crowd in to come up with the innovation and the solutions. I do think that the government policy is needed to set the direction of change and to get the economy moving in a direction. And then then that will crowd in the investment and crowd in the private sector to come in with that money and that innovation and the technologies for that challenge. So a lot of what the role of philanthropic money plays is this critical role in building this funding base that can support the activity that first raises awareness that this is an issue to begin with. How do we elevate this as an important political priority? How do we educate stakeholders, whether they're private or public sector decision makers, on the importance of moving in this direction? How do we get first of a kind projects off the ground? How can we pay for academic research, technical research, for new solutions? And how can we fund civil society groups that can continue to drive change and hold the government and the private sector accountable for where there's a negative externality on the cost of their operations? So we spend a lot of time working with groups who can help support us in that effort and get to that goal of near zero methane emissions as fast as possible. And at a high level, we really focus on the emissions across all the sectors. So that is oil and gas and coal, that's agriculture and waste. And across those sectors, where are the big levers where we can fund groups to build those foundations, implement the solutions, and use Global Methane's hub philanthropic support to help drive that change. So I see this as more as a coordinated approach, where we lay the groundwork for that transformation of changing the sectors, delivering some of those quick wins that we can then scale into systems change. And I see it as collaboration with non-government and government entities to help scale that. And this stuff takes a long time and it's incredibly complicated. We're trying to transform our entire energy system in a historic time frame, and do that across all sectors. So this is incredibly challenging, but we cannot believe that climate is necessarily the most important priority for a country who is trying to develop or has otherwise 10 priorities before they can begin to think about climate. But we can start with these small wins where we set air quality targets, and that gives the signal to the private sector. And that those can be very powerful routes. And then just one other thing, the EU has put forward a historic proposition of the EU global methane import standard, meaning that any gas coming into the EU market is going to have to meet a certain emissions threshold. And as the world's biggest importer of that, the question then becomes, is this a producer economies challenge or is this a consumer economies challenge? I mean, I would argue that, we live in a global world, we're operating in international markets, it's both. So just this sheer signal of the economy moving in that direction is incredibly powerful. But then I completely agree with Eli. We need to get that upfront policy in place, whether it's funding, financing, regulations, seed funding, or policies. But then that sends the signal to the private sector to come in and to innovate and to meet those standards. And then just one final thing, there also then becomes disagreements as what qualifies as under that. So I think that's where a lot of these non-state actors and non-business actors come in with this objective interpretation of what qualifies as clean, what qualifies under that. And I think that's where having these non-profit groups can really play that role and help to hold both sides accountable.
Fantastic. Very quick question, and then I go. Sounds like Joachim, you want to go with the question. And I think,
yeah. So it's I think something we have to admit, people working on decarbonization and climate, is that this isn't actually all about only winners. There are not. It's not that everything we do in climate is going to benefit everyone. So I think like the biggest question the world is going to have to solve for me is what do we do about coal in India? Like everything else is actually, from an emissions perspective, kind of dwarfed by the amount of coal that will be burned in India between now and 2050. There are many, many reasons to stop burning coal. It's bad for, it's really, really bad for the climate, but also a huge proportion of India's economy relies on the mining and distribution of coal, and then it is the cheapest energy source they have available. So there are very few things in the energy transition that are actually only wins. Often the benefits are unevenly distributed. The same even goes for moving to electric vehicles. In the long term, they're cheaper, but maybe they're not manufactured in Detroit. Maybe they're manufactured in China or in Arizona, and that puts people out of a job. The exception to this is methane, and this is why the work that Olivia is doing is so interesting. In that we say methane when we talk in a climate sense, but I think it's important to remember methane is actually just natural gas, same molecule, CH4, and so it is in no one's interest for methane to leak from natural gas pipelines. It is in no one's interest for methane to leak when it's being refined, because that is just the fuel that oil and gas companies are making and selling and burning. And so I think the amazing thing that Olivia has been talking about is not only is it this emergency brake where you can very rapidly pull down probably about 20% of human emissions if you limit methane, but also this is one where everyone's interests align if you have access to capital, because in the long run, stopping methane leaks from oil and gas companies is actually just helping oil and gas companies' bottom line, because every molecule of CH4 that does not escape to the environment is a molecule they can sell and burn. And so this is like the reason I think that everyone is so excited about the work that Olivia and the Global Methane Hub is doing is because this one seems like actually we can get it right. There is no constituency, no oil and gas company, no government that isn't in favor of reducing methane. That's why it's a pretty exciting place to work.
A super good intervention, Eli. And Joachim, in your other life, you have a lot of experience with industrial gases, but also including methane, but also with risk financing. Any question you want to ask from that perspective to Eli and to Olivia?
Well, I think I have a specific one first to Olivia. And looking back at a previous episode, we had a great chat with Michael on nuclear power. So Olivia, how do you and your organization view nuclear power as a solution? And we spoke to Michael also about China is the biggest industrialized country in the world today, making a huge transition, and they're putting out say 50 new reactors as we speak. Is that something that you kind of support, so to speak, as a solution, or is that outside of the scope of where you're looking?
So in my current organization, I would say that nuclear is entirely out of the scope of where we're currently looking. But from my previous work, I can speak a little bit about a pragmatic solutions orientated approach, which, as I mentioned previously, no one knows the direction of travel of where dialing up one piece of the energy system and dialing down another, how that's what the negative knock-on effects will be of doing that. So this is about incremental changes, going sector by sector, industry by industry, country by country, and figuring out what are the solutions that work with those local communities and their local priorities. Building solar panels where the sun is always shining, that would work. But where you've got countries where the conditions are not allowing for that, you have to begin to look at a different solution set. So I'm not really in the camp of pick your favorite climate technology and get behind that. I really am in the camp of pushing for a pragmatic solutions portfolio approach, but I think it's up to the policymakers to really regulate that, control that, and say what qualifies as clean and set that regulatory environment. And now just to touch on the China point as well, I mean, we've seen really, and the India point, and as mentioned, this really is a global south challenge as well. But we've seen fantastic movements coming out of China despite the current political trajectory. And that, a lot of that is down to seeing that we can get groups within China to start to push on methane. We had a non-CO2 gases summit as part of COP, which was the US and China back at COP28, which was an incredible signal of how important and where an example where the US and China can align on getting behind a non-CO2 target. And in China, they've announced developing a coal standard at the end of last year. And the coal mines will now need to go from 30% to 8%. And to change so drastically and see this ambition, it's a huge win. As China industry for so long has not really had the incentives to meet these targets. So I think seeing these top line settings shows that China really is taking this issue seriously. And again, I think this links to the fact that there's the air quality issues and a bunch of other issues that this can also relate to. So we've got a combination of working with groups in China to see some of these changes. And then we talk about energy security as well as another huge challenge. We had the IEA Energy Security Summit hosted with the UK government last week in London, where Ed Miliband said they'd be working with China to continue to raise the importance of methane. So it's very good to hear these political signals that China will continue to prioritize methane reduction as a critical component of their climate strategies. But is it to me to say what is the right thing for your economy? It's about working with those stakeholders.
If to intervene, I think, as a kind of global energy consultant and co-investor in some of these initiatives, myself in my other life, what I can see also sometimes having debate with to take China supply or not. China's players are able to deliver all the technologies. So there is not a choice, I would say, the input gas, there is nuclear technology, there is solar, they're leaking batteries, they're investing in hydrogen. So I would say quite broad palette, but it's really good you're highlighting some of their also anti-mess. I think from energy security perspective, if you don't have natural gas resources, it really makes sense to also diversify. Absolutely. To go to Eli, how would you see, lowering risk, right, and cost of capital? I think that's that's if I also take some of your earlier statements. How can we, in this both maybe in global south and global north, how can we lower this risk and lower cost of capital? I mean, last time I went to a European bank, they said, Eric, venture debt, we can give it to you at 7%. And if it's, uh, if we think you're more risk, well, 9%. So 7 to 9%, one can, with a bit of a funding round, you can get money now in Europe. Is that maybe good enough?
Yeah. Okay. So I will respond on the cost of capital point, but first I wonder, have any of you ever been to a nuclear power plant?
Sorry,
to a nuclear power plant. Have you ever been to a nuclear power plant?
Yes. Oh, in Netherlands, there is one in Borssele, so sure. And well.
I've not been to one in the Netherlands, but it's probably the same everywhere. It's like stepping into the 1950s. So everything has to be exactly under the schematic of when the power plant was designed. So you go into an elevator, and it's like you're stepping into an elevator from the 1950s. You go into the cafe, it's like you're stepping into the cafe from the 1950s. And the reason is that the regulatory regimes we use to approve nuclear power plants don't let you change a single thing. They're like that for somewhat legitimate reasons about safety. They're very, very anti any innovation and any change. And so the fact that we don't have nuclear power or new nuclear power really in the United States or anywhere in Europe except for really France is like a self-inflicted wound. And I think one of the great public policy failures in the world of energy over the last 50 years. You can read about the world people thought we were going to get in the 1970s. And one of the things that like it's shocking to me that it's not happened is that the cost of nuclear power on a delivered basis has gone up. And so to your question about cost of capital, I mean, I will answer it. There is a whole other thing that we're going to need to talk about, which is what in economics we would call a non-financial barrier to getting the energy transition done in developed economies. Because actually, I'm not sure who you were talking to that was offering you venture debt in Europe. But if you want to build energy infrastructure in the European Union or in the United States, and you have a PPA, an offtake agreement from a credit-worthy source, you can get very, very cheap debt. That is the business model of utilities. Huge amounts of leverage with very cheap debt from the developed financial markets. And that cost of capital question in America and in Europe is not the thing stopping us. The thing holding us back is regulation and a lack of transmission infrastructure. So I think that cost of capital is hugely important for new technologies. So what is going to power the energy in 2040, 2050, 2060 when we think about venture and hydrogen? But for the next 10, 15 years of energy deployment, that is not the thing holding back developed markets. It is basically that we've made it very hard to build. And the energy transition requires a huge amount of building. Ezra Klein's work on abundance is like the case in point in this. Your question, though, on cost of capital in developing countries, I think is super pertinent. Because if you think about, as I said in the beginning, this needs to be private sector investment. And value for the private sector is basically created by the return of a project being higher than the cost of capital. So this is like the fundamental truth of all private investment in every sector in every country in the world. The private sector borrows at their cost of capital and they invest and they get a return. And economic value is the difference between your cost of capital and your return. And that means that in somewhere like, let's say, sub-Saharan Africa or Pakistan, when the risk-free rate, so the government borrowing rate is 10, 15, 20%, and the private sector borrowing rate is even higher than that, in order to create economic value, which is when you have returns that are greater than your cost of borrowing, you're going to need 30% on your project, and there is not a renewable project on Earth that has a 30% unlevered return. And so you're completely right that the cost of capital is the question. How do we solve it is a very composite answer, and we this is half of what we do at the Harvard Kennedy School. So I don't have an easy answer. Maybe I'll tell you the buckets. One approach is what people call blended finance, which is basically you don't really solve the question. You don't lower the actual cost of capital. You bribe the private sector to invest. And so you say that the private sector is still going to invest at this high cost of capital of 15 or 20%. We'll give a bunch of concessional financing at 0 or 5 or 10. And the blended cost of capital is low enough that it's below the returns. And what that means is reforming the World Bank, upping lending from international development, increasing government capacity to borrow, etc. That's a whole kind of bucket of policies, blended finance. But then the other one, and this is kind of why I said in the beginning, what brought me to the energy transition is not particularly decarbonization. These are the same questions we have for any development. How do you lower risk in an economy? Part of it is good governance, part of it is good laws, part of it is reforms of the banking sector. I could go on, but I actually don't think this is an intrinsic question to the energy transition, because solar is not a risky technology. Wind is not really a risky technology. They're very, very proven. The problem is that the off-taker for the electricity doesn't have the capacity to pay. People in Burundi are poor. And that's the issue here, not really the technology itself. Does that make sense?
It does. We will be now, let's say, kind of closing into the last 5 minutes or so. I loved your, well, let's say, conceptual. I think sometimes we actually need concepts and not just only answers. Like, I think this is really helpful to have this, let's say, buckets of thinking on how to lower cost of capital. And I appreciate I'm asking a huge question to be answered in a few minutes. Now we'll go to Joachim for one closing question, and then Jackie will help us go to the coffee machine and kind of give us some final reflections. So Joachim, first to you.
Yeah, I will expand it a little bit before we go into closing then, because there is one aspect we haven't really addressed here, and that is energy efficiency. Because if we increase the energy efficiency, so we use less now, and even if there is an expanding use of energy in general, if we do that more efficiently, there's less transition to make, so to speak, which is in a way also a way to lower the required investment. How do you view that? Not at least from a financial point of view. Is there more to do to facilitate if we can reduce the, let's say, fuel consumption in various industries by 10, 20, 25% or so, and look at that in comparison to do investments in solar, so to speak? I mean, do you see that there is a skewed focus perhaps, or is it treated equally, or does it get the attention that it should, or should it get less attention, or particularly to Eli here, please?
Sure, I can start, and then Olivia, if you want to go after. This feels to me like the great moment when economist models meet the real world, and it turns out the economist models were completely inaccurate. So we have this concept of it's called a marginal abatement curve, marginal cost of abatement. So how much do you have to invest or pay to abate or not emit 1 ton of CO2? And the cheapest answer is always what you brought up, Joachim. Like, this should be one of those things, like I talked about with methane, where really everyone's interests should align. Like with methane, there is not a natural constituency against energy efficiency. It's sort of really in everyone's interests. It saves you money on your bill. It saves energy. It's better for the planet. Yet inexplicably, we're really bad at it. And so there have been government programs, and there have been startups for the last 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, even before we were thinking about climate, just from an economic perspective, trying to increase energy efficiency. And the economists will tell you that, like, everyone should be doing this. Everyone where the cost of delivered electricity is lower than natural gas should be installing heat pumps. And in a lot of jurisdictions, the UK, certain states in America, the government will basically pay for the installation of your heat pump, which turns heating of your electricity of your home to be electric rather than gas. And yet people don't really do it. And this is a question that it's really, really hard to answer sort of theoretically from a finance perspective, because you need the incentives to be crazy. I think this is what we have learned about individual responses. People just are not that good at understanding like the long-term economic function that you can make money with energy efficiency. Maybe it's what in economics you would call a shoe leather cost, like a transaction cost. Like, people just don't like going through this installation and having builders in their homes. Maybe it's something to do with what people would call salience, so we don't really understand that you can save money in the long term. So like the economist in me completely agrees with you, Joachim, which is this should be the low-hanging fruit, just like methane. Everyone's interests align. But then the, maybe slightly irrational consumer in me realizes that I own an apartment and I did not install a heat pump in it, even though it's probably in my interest to do so, and the government would pay me to, because it seems like a pain in the ass. And so this is something that honestly I think we need a lot more thinking, maybe not from finance and economists, but from like psychologists, about how to make people do the thing that's in their interest.
Oh, thank you so much, both. We're starting to run out of time, and I feel like we could be speaking about this forever. Actually, I feel like I was a listener today. I was so interested in everything that was being said, and honestly, thank you so much to both of you. I think we really shed some light on some really important things. But at the end of our show, what we always like to do is we have this segment where we ask. First, I ask my co-host, and then I'll ask you both, our guests, if our listeners could take just one thought away from the conversation today to discuss around the coffee cart, what would you want that thought to be? So I'll ask Eric first, and then Olivia and Eli, you can start thinking about that one thought for our listeners. Eric.
I think for me, it's very clearly that what I learned, there was a bit of a light in my head that we, it's not about the focusing on the news items of that there is some money less, let's say, public funding going from United States to the global economies. Actually, the real question should be how do we continue to lower the risk of energy investments? And I think that's so. At least I already learned in this small exercise, and what I also liked that I learned from Olivia is that let's say there is different perspectives on let's say usefulness of methane, but at least admitting that we should immediately reduce any leakage actually is also in the interest of energy majors. So those are two things I'm learning. Moving to Joachim.
Very much the same as your takeaways, Eric. I would say I think it's extremely important to highlight the role of methane here. The methane leakage is already from the source and all the way. And it's great that you're working with that, Olivia, for sure. And the other one is risk. I mean, risk translates into costs, and we have a world today where many people feel that there are higher risks, unfortunately, which is driving up the cost of capital. And we have to think about how we can what we can do to drive down risk. So that's a thought something I would discuss at the coffee machine would be how can we work together to get risks down, because there could be some ways to to spread the risks to make the total risk smaller, perhaps by various corporations, and in a more peaceful world. In that case, also a more peaceful world would be probably lower the cost of capital as well, right? Those are some things I would address at the coffee machine.
Yeah.
Okay.
Agreed completely, Joachim. I think something that really came across really strongly to me was that idea of collaboration from Olivia, and that we can only do things in a collaborative way. And I also loved when Eli said, there are very few things in the energy transition that is just wins. And I think sometimes we just get focused too much just on the wins. And, maybe we need to realize that it's not a, zero-sum game sort of thing. So thank you. And Eli? Your takeaways. What should people take away? 2 seconds on what they should take away.
Okay, sure. I'll try and be quick. So, first of all, there's something like really funny about this gathering, which is that Eric, Olivia, and I met randomly at like 1 a.m. in a bar in Baku at COP29. And so, like this conversation itself is a product of hopefully the least impactful product, but still a product of multilateralism. And so I'm a big believer that when, like you said, Jackie, when countries come together, we can do great things. We are unfortunately in an era where, in many sectors, multilateralism is declining. And there are many things I could say about this, of what it means for peace and what it means for science and what it means for prosperity. Specifically for the energy transition, though, the types of energy and the types of technologies that are going to be favored in a world that is more fractured actually, to some extent, align with reducing carbon emissions. And I think this is an interesting thought, which is that the global oil market, and increasingly since the advent of natural gas, the global gas market, are unbelievably globalized. And they're really driven by globalization allowed fossil fuels to be this unbelievable substance that it extracted in one place, refined in another, burned in another, And actually, as we pull back from some of that globalization, and countries' key priority becomes energy security and making sure you're not exposed to conflicts in the Middle East driving up the price of oil, or Russian gas being turned off from a war. I actually think that is going to renew political interest in solar, which is generated wherever it's the sun shines, or nuclear energy, or electric vehicles, which are charged on the grid and you don't need to import diesel. And so there is like a flicker of something good in the fracturing of the global system, in that energy security necessarily dictates generating your energy where it's used, and that really means nuclear power or renewables. And so there are there are trends that are pushing towards decarbonization, even as some of these much more grand political bargains that would allow things like COP to continue, for the moment, seems to be less in vogue.
Thank you. And Olivia?
Yeah, so I would agree with Eli. And just to add, I think building awareness of the strategies outside what's seen as traditional climate world, which is why the work of the Global Methane Hub really exists, is to elevate the important role of methane alongside the other issues. And having a more expansive way of thinking for a more inclusive framework of what it takes to get to a system that's kinder to the environment, and whatever those levers are, we need to take into account the complexity of the issue. And I think that really calls for, rather than or, it's a and we need all of the above, so that we can have all the tools in the toolkit to drive a systems change on a scale that's the global energy system. And I think in a world of divisions, I think I always say it's best, like, focus on where we can agree and build from there. So if you agree that energy security is a priority, if you believe that breathing clean air is a priority, then focus on those. And I think, and just recognizing the important contributions that are needed for across all the different sectors. And I think, we can do modeling, but no one can really predict what's going to happen in the world and the way this will go. So it's about having a long-term time horizon, but being flexible and along the way tinkering, dialing up one part of the energy system and where we need to be. But I think on the topic of methane in general, and that whole pulling of the emergency brake, this is medicating the existing system and just making sure the appropriate standards are in place to hold accountable the industry for their pollution, clean up after you. So I guess, yeah, for me, my takeaway is really focus on the solutions and focus on where you agree and build from there.
Thank you. I think that's so powerful. And I think, we've gone from a bar in Baku to a podcast where we're all sitting in 5 different countries. And I really think that our listeners, wherever they are, will be able to take something from what has been said today, whether it's finance, collaboration, how to solve fragmentation. I really think that there's something for everyone. So just to end off, thank you, Eli. Thank you, Olivia, so much for joining us. We've really enjoyed having you, and we hope that you have a wonderful day.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.